Hey class, welcome back. I hope you guys are all doing well. We finished up the American Revolution last time in the establishment of the government, and today we are going to be continuing on with our revolutions lecture series, and we're going to be looking at the French Revolution. Now, one thing I do want to point out in this PowerPoint coming up with the French Revolution is that there was, once the revolution started, there begins this shift in government structures. And these government structures are on the PowerPoint or on the top, the header bar of the PowerPoint, and it's in red. It'll be a red title for what the government structure is, such as the Legislative Assembly, National Convention, Directory, Consulate. They have a shift in all these. When the king is overthrown, when Louis the 16th is overthrown, we have the shift in what the government was. And so during the shifts in government, paralleling that are the events of the revolution, especially with the spike of killings by the guillotine. So called the Reign of Terror is one of the phases of the revolution. So kind of pay attention to that as you're going through the PowerPoint here. As I talk, it'll be under the headings of the different government structures. And I'll try to explain that out in the PowerPoint. But what's going to happen is the French Revolution starts, and it goes, in this PowerPoint we're going to look at, it goes all the way up to where Napoleon ends the French Revolution by taking control of the entire country and establishing himself as emperor. So when you're listening through this PowerPoint lecture, keep in mind it's for a purpose. It's what it's doing is it's laying the stage for Napoleon to come up and take power. And again, Napoleon becoming the Emperor of France is just a watershed moment in Europe and in France, obviously, but for the world stage itself because of what takes place in Napoleon's activities when he's in power. Okay, so we're going to now move into the French Revolution. Okay, class, we are now going to move into Revolutions Part 4. So today we're going to be speaking about the French Revolution and just some background information about the French Revolution. Again, it's not that people are just living their happy lives and all of a sudden decide we're going to revolt against our government. There's background issues that take place. So in the 1780s, France is in deep debt with war debts. Half of all their revenue was covering these war debts, to include the war in America, the American Revolution, or the Revolutionary War. Half of France's revenue is going to pay for these wars that they're in, one being the Revolutionary War. But then on top of that, another quarter of their revenue is being used to supply the French military. So if you think about the amount of money being spent by the French on war debts and then military, it comes out to 3/4 of the country's income. And that's a lot of money to go just to those specific areas. That doesn't leave too much left for the operation of a country. So what do the French do? Well, they decide that they're going to increase taxes with high taxes on the aristocrats, which are the upper class. It could be the nobility, but the aristocrats. So these are the upper class people, and the upper class people, they're living, fat and happy. They're living a good life. They have mansions, they have estates, they have a lot of food and servants, and they're just living a good life because they're the upper class. So putting these extra taxes or high taxes on the aristocrats makes the upper class makes them angry. They don't like these taxes put on them. So what happens is the aristocrats call for Louis the 16th to deal with this problem. And so what happens is they resurrect an organization or a government body, I should say it that way, called the Estate General. Now, the Estate General was a representative council that was defunct. It had not been in operation for a long time. So the Estate General of 1789 is called. This defunct representative council was established in 1303, but had not met since 1614. And so now it's a good amount of time has gone by since this group even met. And obviously, if the last time they met, 1614, no one's alive that met. So this is going to be a whole new council called the Estate General. So the aristocrats call for Louis XVI to reestablish this to deal with these taxes. But what he's thinking is that he'll actually use it to increase taxes so he can continue to live his lavish lifestyle, but also to continue to or to deal with the aristocrats' anger. So in this Estate General, there's representation for three groups. The first estate represents 100,000 Roman Catholic clergy. The second estate represents 400,000 nobles or aristocrats. And the third estate represents 24 million French or common people. So you can see it is just way lopsided towards the French common people. So these representatives are called estates. So one estate for the Catholics, one clergy, one estate is for the nobles, and one estate is for the French common people. So here's the issue. The third estate representing the people, although they had representatives, they only had one vote as an estate. Well, notice there were 24 million people being represented. So it was seriously lopsided. And so the third estate demanded political reform, and along with that, demands social reform. Well, what happens is they don't come to a consensus, and they're very upset. The third estate becomes very upset. And on June 17th, 1789, after fruitless debate, the third estate storms out of the meeting, and they go to a nearby tennis court, and they swear to break away and create a constitution. This meeting on the tennis court is called the Tennis Court Oath. And what happens is, because they break away and they want to create their own constitution, they form a new body called the National Assembly. The National Assembly. Well, what happens is violence breaks out between the royal forces and the National Assembly forces, or the commoners. So the royal forces are the ones that are nobles, they're the aristocrats, they're the ones loyal to the king, all of that. And then the National Assembly forces are basically the commoners. And how many were there? The third estate was representing 24 million commoners. I mean, a massive amount of people. So this isn't good. You have a massive amount of people, 24 million, that are very upset. They break away, and now they're basically drawing lines against the first and second estate, the Catholic clergy and the nobles/aristocrats. Now violence breaks out. So we're really setting the stage now for a revolution. The National Assembly. On July 14th, 1789, an event takes place called the storming of the Bastille. The Bastille was a prison in Paris. And the story behind this is that crowds stormed the Bastille prison in search of weapons. The military in the prison, which is loyal to the king, which is loyal to the aristocrats, basically because they're paying their paycheck, the military in the prison fight off the crowds for a while, and they end up killing many commoners. But finally, the crowd overtakes the prison and hacks the military garrison, that's the soldiers in the fort, hacks them to death. They take their heads, stick them on spikes, and walk around the city of Paris through the streets with these heads on the pikes. So just a gruesome scene. The forces loyal to the king flee the city, and Paris is in the hands of the people. Here's a picture of the storming of the Bastille prison in Paris. Revolution and fighting spreads throughout France. The Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen in 1789 is produced, and this basically was a declaration for the equality of men, the sovereignty resides with the people, rights of life, liberty, and security. So if you're thinking back to the lecture on the Enlightenment, these are definitely big key points for the Enlightenment. And the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen is very much like the Declaration of Independence was for the colonists against the British. Okay, so we have this revolution and fighting has spread throughout France. First off, Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizens produced. Second, there's a war with Austria that complicates matters. And the issue with this is that Leopold II, who is Marie Antoinette's brother, and Marie Antoinette is Louis XVI's wife. So there's this relationship within through marriage. Leopold II is Austrian emperor, and he has alliances with other pro-French monarchy nations. And so basically these nations, they like Louis. Well, the French revolutionaries tell Leopold to break off this these alliances with these other pro-French monarchy nations. So the revolutionaries tell Leopold, hey, cut your alliances with these other nations that like Louis, like the monarchy. Well, Leopold II refuses, and this leads to war. Okay, so the French Revolution, the Legislative Assembly. 1791 to 1792, France becomes a constitutional monarchy. So similar to Great Britain. France becomes a constitutional monarchy where men with property, about half the population own property, they have the right to vote in their representatives. And this is an Enlightenment ideal. This is good. This is what the Enlightenment would say should happen. But really what happens is it leads to more death because the revolutionary fighting continues. It's during this time, 1791 to 1792, that we have the adoption of the guillotine to execute people. This is a symbol of terror. Obviously, you know what I have a picture coming up, but the guillotine cutting off people's heads. So symbol of terror. Thousands are executed in France, and actually death by guillotine stayed on the books for France. The last person killed by guillotine was in 1977. So I was 1 year old when that last execution took place by the guillotine. The reason I'm bringing up this whole legislative assembly and all of it, this is setting up for what's going to take place where Napoleon grabs power. Okay, so the legislative assembly is kind of the government establishment. It's constitutional monarchy, so there's still a king, but they have an assembly now kind of running the government. So they adopt the guillotine for execution. They adopt the tricolor flag, so that's the French red, white, and blue flag. And then they adopt the song La Marseillaise. I don't speak French, so I did the best I could. La Marseillaise, which this is the French national anthem. Okay, so here's a picture of the guillotine. So you see the body up there. His head's already cut off because of the bloody blade. And you have the guy holding the head. Now, this was for the revolutionaries and all of that. This is a big show. People would come out and watch this, almost kind of like entertainment. You have the next person in line up here at the top of the steps. She's about to get laid down and get her head cut off. She's in, her hands are bound. You have some soldiers here who are going to make sure this goes on. This execution takes place. I mean, you have this lady down here. She's sitting down here like knitting. So, just a big show. Just another thing to go out and watch. Not good if you're on the anti-revolutionary side. Okay, 1792 to 1795 is the National Convention. Louis XVI resisted the advice of the constitutional monarchist revolutionaries. So we have a constitutional monarchy. The revolutionaries are okay with that, this assembly, legislative assembly. Well, Louis XVI is resisting this. And so in October of 1789, a revolutionary mob marches on Versailles. So remember, a couple lectures ago, we talked about Versailles. This is where the palace is. This is where the king is. And Louis XVI and his wife, Marie Antoinette, they flee the palace because this mob attacks the palace. In June 1791, they have to flee again, and this time they try to flee to Austria. But on their way to Austria, they're caught on the road and they're hauled back to Paris. Louis XVI is forced to accept the Constitution, and the monarchy is now just a figurehead with no power. So by accepting this Constitution, all power has now gone into the government, which is called the National Convention. So here's two pictures. There's one of Louis XVI on the left, and then one of Marie Antoinette on the right, husband and wife. They were not good monarchs. He was a chubby guy that liked his pleasure, and she was an immature woman who liked to play queen over her own little realm. So much so that at the Palace of Versailles there was a village built just for Marie Antoinette to play in. And so here's a painting of her in her village. And so back here is supposed to be Louis XVI. These are some ladies in waiting. But here's Marie Antoinette sitting on the bench with a maid coming up with flowers. Now all of these buildings back here, this is her village that was built for her to play in, like she was the queen of this village. Very immature. And this is a view from the sky of Marie Antoinette's play village that's today. And I'm going to put the cursor on the screen. If you can follow my arrow going around these walkway paths, this is her village. These have been refurbished, but these are houses and buildings. These are full-size houses, several stories tall, several like additions and gardens. Here's more houses over here around this lake. This was built for her so she could play in it. The issue is that during the French Revolution, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, they're having all kinds of food and living in this palace and all of that. When the people are starving, they can't even have bread. And that's where you get this phrase Marie Antoinette supposedly said, if they want bread, then let them eat cake, because she was just so disconnected from the poor, starving commoners, which was the majority of France. So that's why the mob came and stormed the place. So this is Marie Antoinette's village that she would play in. Again, this is a grown woman playing it. Okay, National Convention continued 1792 to 1795. In November of 1792, Louis XVI is tried by the National Convention for treason after evidence he was plotting to get help from Austria to overthrow the revolutionaries. The revolutionaries are now backing the National Convention. January 21st, 1793, Louis XVI is beheaded by guillotine. That's a big deal. You have the king of France, his head's cut off. October 16th, 1793, Marie Antoinette, she is beheaded by the guillotine. And the next man on stage is Maximilien de Robespierre. You may have heard of him, Robespierre. So what happens is, after they're killed, Robespierre, who's in the government, he's radical. They take over, the radicals take over. And it's led by Robespierre, who is basically one of the leaders of the Reign of Terror, which was a phase of the French Revolution, especially when a lot of people were killed during the Reign of Terror. It was a year-long time of a lot of people being killed. So the radicals take over, and he is leader of the Reign of Terror. He's the leader of the Jacobin Party, and they dominate the National Convention. So the radicals are in charge now. There's a picture of him. So continuing with Robespierre, the radicals take over, and he's the leader of the Reign of Terror. He's the leader of the Jacobin Party, and he's also the leader of the Committee of Public Safety. Now, this committee, created by the National Convention, was to be an executive kind of branch of the government, especially during that Reign of Terror, like I said, 1793 to 1794, which we're coming up to here on the next slide. And what the purpose of this executive portion of the government, this Committee of Public Safety, the importance of it is that it was to protect France from enemies, foreign and domestic. And so you can think of, foreign enemies, it's easy to, obviously it's a foreigner trying to invade or something, but domestic enemies, that's important because it's basically saying whoever the government says is an enemy, a domestic enemy, then you can deal with them. Protect France from these domestic enemies, and a lot of people would go to the guillotine. Under Robespierre, the government leadership became dictatorial. So you went from a king with a constitutional monarchy, and the government was called a national convention, to basically the king being killed. Robespierre is the leader, and the government's still called national convention, but it's a dictatorship. The Reign of Terror is from 1793 to 1794. It's a phase of the French Revolution, and basically it began with the overthrow of the Girondins, which was a political party in the convention. Okay, so in the convention of political parties, the Girondins were one of them, and the rise of the Jacobins under Robespierre. So you have the Girondins and the Jacobins are gaining popularity and gaining power, and they overthrow the Girondins. And in this 1 year, 1,400 people were guillotined in 1 year. And it was to purge the country of enemies of the revolution. So that's the important part. When you start saying to protect from enemies foreign and domestic, well, who's the domestic enemy? Well, in Robespierre's mind, the domestic enemy is someone that's against the revolution. So you start killing people that are against the revolution. That's why the French Revolution became very bloody, because of trying to purge the politics of opposing views. So here's a picture. It's a painting, pretty famous painting, called The Reign of Terror. And again, you see it's a big crowd. They're coming out. The guy's about ready to be laid down there to get his head cut off. So, kind of like a public spectacle, spectator sport. 1792 to 1795, continuing that time period of the French Revolution, we have the counter-revolution of 1794. And what's happening is that Robespierre was becoming too radical for the radicals. And so on July 27th, 1794, his political opponents, who are revolutionaries themselves, okay, don't forget that. Okay, right now when I'm talking, we're not talking about the king and revolutionaries. We're talking about revolutionaries against revolutionaries. So the political opponents of Robespierre, they take a stand against him. Robespierre is arrested, but then he was released after his arrest. The counter-revolution infuriates him, and he rallies his forces to combat the people that are now rising up against him. And however, he's captured and then he's executed. So Robespierre is kind of out of the picture. But that leads to the Thermidorian reaction. The Thermidorian reaction is this: after the execution of Robespierre and his supporters, the moderate revolutionaries take control of the revolution, the French Revolution. So Robespierre was radical. Well, now the reaction to this, based on the counter-revolution, is that the moderates take place, kind of more, let's say, level-headed, if you will. Moderates take control of the French Revolution to try to calm it down. So here's a picture of Robespierre being executed. All right, so the French Revolution, another shift in government where it goes from the National Convention to the Directory. 1795, the Directory is set up, and that is a group of 5 men who collectively held executive power in France. And this is according to the Constitution of 1795. Now, these 5 men were chosen by a newly established legislature, which contained 2 houses, a lower house and an upper house. The lower house is the Council of 500, which is representative of the commoners. The Council of Ancients is the upper house, and these would be more of the aristocrats or the nobility. Again, the nobility are still there. It's not like all the nobility are killed or anything like that. It's just that this revolution is taking place. So these 5 men are chosen by the legislature. Leaders in this government actually then become corrupt. And what happens is the Directory is overthrown by Napoleon Bonaparte on November 9th of 1799 at the coup of Brumaire. So this is the Directory. 1799 to 1804, we have the Consulate. This is the last government structure for the French Revolution. It was ruled from the fall of the Directory until the start of the Napoleonic Empire in 1804. Now, the Consulate is ruled by Napoleon Bonaparte. So the Directory is overthrown by Napoleon, and it basically morphs into the Consulate. And this is ruled by Napoleon, by Abbe Sess, and by Roger Ducos. Now, these 3 guys are supposed to be equal in power as a consulate, and to be they're able to run the country now. In 1804, Napoleon was the most popular of the consulate, and basically history states that he has 99% approval of the people, which is just extraordinary to have that high of approval rating. Just recently, the President of the United States had a 49% approval rating, which was considered high, that about half the country supports him or says he's doing a good job. Well, in 1804, Napoleon supposedly had 99% approval. And what he does is he consolidates his power to be the most powerful of the 3 men, Bonaparte, Sess, and Ducos. So Bonaparte definitely comes out as the most powerful, and in 1804, he overthrows the consulate and declares himself the Emperor of France. There's Napoleon, his trademark stance with his hand inside of his waistcoat. And that's going to be it for the French Revolution, because the next lecture coming up is going to be on Napoleon himself. So we'll be looking at that. Okay, class, that's going to be it for the French Revolution. We've now set the stage for Napoleon. As we've just finished, Napoleon has declared himself emperor. So in our next PowerPoint lecture, we're going to be looking at Napoleon himself, his life, and his exploits, and what he did to basically make a name for himself, to where he is just renowned throughout history as a dictator in France, and leading France into a really rough time of war with most of the other powers within Europe. So we'll be looking at that next time. Okay? Take care.